Good afternoon and welcome to the third and final day of the first edition of the conference of What If World History, or WhatIf’21, being held this year at the Faculty of Fine Arts of the University of Porto, the faculty of the Host Partner Research Center for 2021 I2ADS. Though more formal acknowledgements surely will be made during the closing session, I nevertheless would like to once again express my gratitude for the institutions that partnered with Evento Imaginária and I2ADS for this conference and the Hypothesis Project, namely Casa Comum of the Rectorate of the University of Porto, Requinte and Setups, especially in the person of their directors, Professors Fátima Vieira, Baltasar de Castro, and Paulo Luís Almeida, as well as the Dean of the University of Porto, Professor António Sousa Pereira. But an event is only as good as those that participate in it, and either as authors or invitees, we are honored and grateful to all of them, especially for those in the invited lectures, namely Professors Rosa Ricoy, Nelson Zagallo, Fátima Lambert, and also the invited lecturer for this session, Professor Maria João Fonseca, which I will introduce more formally a bit later in a few moments. And also, an event is only as perfect as those that are dealing with the logistics. And for them, I have a great thank you to the I2ADS researchers, Margarida Diaz and Fábio Fava. And now, the invitee for this invited lectures face-to-face session. With a background in animal biology and biology teaching and a PhD in science, education and communication, Professor Maria João Fonseca is currently head of communication at the Natural History and Science Museum of the University of Porto. She is in charge of general administration and of coordinating and promoting science communication and outreach activities. She has been involved in the design and evaluation of formal and informal educational activities, teacher training, and outreach initiatives for all sorts of audiences. Also, she is currently part of the team responsible for the reconstruction of the Natural History and Science Museum of the University of Porto. And being museums usually more focused in preserving the past, thus sustaining the collective knowledge and shared memories, why the presence of the Natural History and Science Museum in an alternative and counterfactual conference. In fact, that will be the core of this session, how alternative history and the museum's collections and depositories not only can have symbiosis, but that such a symbiosis should be promoted. And to understand, and to understand better the context of the session, I start by saying that the Natural History and Science Museum of the University of Porto is at present exploring such possibilities in a partnership that involves the alternative history wine-punk universe. Thus, the title of our session, Imagination, Stories, and Museum Collections, How Alternative History Sustains Rediscovering Stored Knowledge. So, in order to provide the necessary background to understand the session, I would like to first briefly introduce the fictional wine-punk universe, and then afterwards, Professor Maria João and I will talk about all these possibilities. So, if we could please share the slides. So, in the beginning of the 20th century, Portugal was under severe change, both political and cultural. The king was murdered in 1908, and 2 years later, in October the 5th, 1910, the Republic was imposed in Portuguese territory, but not without resentment in some of those monarchic followers. In the following turmoil, the monarchy of the North is established in 1919. It lasted nearly a month, 3 weeks actually, and collapsed in anger, treason, and malicious humor from the south. The Kingdom of Belangemland, or in Portuguese, Reino da Traulitânia, was a nickname that Lisbon bestowed upon this very short-lived monarchy. But what if it had lasted more than a month? What if it had not collapsed among intrigue and treason, but rather it had thrived among those? What if the Northerners had obtained an alternative source of energy similar to coal and oil inefficiency, but from another organic source, the port wine, an energy source able to sustain the rebel kingdom, not only against the Republic South, but also against other nations? A new pawn in the world geopolitical chess game disputed between America and England, the oldest ally of the Douro region. History would not have been the same again, and neither would have been port wine, or wine for that matter. The wine punk universe is defined within this fictional perimeter. For 3 amazing years, the Porto's British past and the Toriga grape vineyards melt in a new reality. A world with technology from the port wine cellars, rebel, idiosyncratic, and ferocious, as only the most conservative societies can be, in an iconography as local as recognizable around the world. To hold the universe in the palm of your hand as we seek a well-aged Porto. The established official alternative timeline that follows, that I will briefly introduce, includes also an official source for the vinous technology, which is based in a modified yeast, the Saccharomyces monarchica, which will increase exponentially the efficiency of the fermentation of the port wine, therefore permitting its use as alcohol as an alternative fuel. So our journey begins properly with a prequel, build up to the divergent point that starts the wine punk reality. So in 1918, the Portuguese Expeditionary Corps suffered severe casualties, namely in the Battle of Lally in the First World War, that ended 6 months later. There had been historical fiction in recent years that artistically express what the documents of the time do, and the sorrow, resentment, and anger among the Portuguese that survive and return, and among those that welcome these Portuguese back, which began to share such feelings in many occasions. And resentment can go a long way. So in 1919, we have that the north of Portugal unilaterally decided to declare that Portugal was now divided in 2 parts, the monarchy of the north and the Portuguese Republic, which had capital in Lisbon, as opposed to the other new capital at the north, Porto. The monarchic troops of the north start their campaigns and are stopped at Águeda, but, and this is the first historical divergence of this universe so far, they are saved by the quick intervention from a monarchic column of the city of Guarda, commanded by a natural historical figure, Francisco Rolão, and it destroys the Republican hopes for victory in the Battle of Barreiras. And by February the 16th, Paiva Coceiro, which was the effective ruler of the monarchy of the North, responds to the condemnation of the insurrection by the deposed king, King Manuel II, with a menace: we will have a king, even that it shall be another king. And this message is trusted to the first agent, secret agent of the new monarchic intelligence service department. This part is fiction, obviously, which escapes the Republican naval blockade. As a result, the King Dom Manuel is able to arrive to La Coruña by the end of the month. Meanwhile, the Russian scientist Ilya Ilyich Mechnikov, which was an actual historical figure, though deceased in 1916, that is kept alive for this alternate universe, was a guest at the Pasteur Institute of Porto since the beginning of 1919, and he offers his help to the monarchy of the North. And taking in account his experience in warfare during the First World War, which is an historical fact, the offer is accepted. And now new players come into game, as the attitude of Spanish troops that were sent to stop the monarch in La Coruña causes a nationalistic fury in the Galicians, resulting in a bloodbath in Santiago de Compostela, leading for the King Dom Manuel II arriving at Vigo, just after Galicia declaring its union to the monarchy of the North. So now we have that from Douro above, all of it is monarchy of the North, and opposing, obviously, to battling Lisbon and the Republic, and also now Spain, who did not like losing Galicia. And with the help of the Mechnikov scientific knowledge, he presented the development of the production of the biofuel from the port wine based on the new yeast species and new bellic vehicles that are true heirs to the World War tanks that are called the mechas. All of this is fictional in this alternative universe. And with these new weapons, the monarchy of the North inflicts severe casualties to the Republic Army forces, leading Lisbon to engage on tactics to prevent the South from joining the rebels of the North. Spain also, by late June of 1919, attempts to conquer Braganza during the Battle of Botelhão and is defeated by the joint forces of the Portuguese and Galician armies. And on early September, the rebellion of the Catalonia begins. As rebellions tend to spread around, it's something like that, and lead the foreign press to designate the Iberian Peninsula as the Iberian Cauldron. And as Spanish officers are unable to stop the defeats, one after another, a coup d'etat is led by General Primo de Rivera and sanctioned by King Alfonso XIII, establishing a dictatorship, something that is an historical fact but happened only 2 years later in real history. So, in January of 1920, pressured in 3 fronts, Galicia, Catalonia, and Morocco, the Spanish dictatorship hires the German Hugo Stolzenberg, specialist in chemical weapons, and also this is an historical fact, but that happened only 1 year later in real history, and starts to collaborate with him and also with the Portuguese Republicans. So now, this, you might be wondering, this is simply an Iberian tale. But no, we start to gamble with the entire world. So in 1920, the actress Gabi Deli was a former love of King Manuel II, dies in Paris. And the monarch that had widowed in 1919 embarks on a journey to the United States of America to fight depression and gain financial support. And he gains more than he bargained for, arriving amidst the news of amazing victories of the naval aeronautics fleets of the monarchy of the North that stopped a Spanish invasion in the Battle of the Mackerels. The American press takes his side and the king returns to Europe, engaged with Mary Pickford and the financial support that the monarchy needed. And in the beginning of the spring of 1920, Mary Pickford becomes, by marriage, Queen Maria III of the monarchy of the North. Thomas Townsend Brown, that came with the royal couple from the United States of America, starts to develop his concept of Liefeld-Brown effect, something that is also an historical fact, but also happened only 1 year after and in a different country, for the monarchy of the North. And in November of the same year, England finally decides to help the monarchy and invades the Spanish-controlled part of Galicia, establishing a new British government there. Secretly, the Order of St. George, a monarchic secret society related with the department, the monarchy of the North secret agency, tries to stop the king from accepting this help. Okay. So, there are many more episodes. It's a very well-established chronology. And from here, I salute Professor Rogério Ribeiro, who was really the brain behind this amazing alternative history chronology. And we are not here just to talk about the wine universe. It was just to give a bit of a background, introduction to the context. And the context is this imagined world that never happened, but many parts of it could have been happened. And it can enhance, enlighten, and further delight us with a symbiosis with the collection and mission of the Natural History and Science Museum of the University of Porto. And specifically, it can be also a tool in science communication. And in fact, we had, in the early 20th century, though it's not still officially part of the wine punk universe, an amazing scientist, Ferreira da Silva.
Yes.
And now I would like to ask to Professor Maria João to talk to us a bit about Ferreira da Silva and
how we could be part of this parallel or at least imagined universe.
Yes.
So Professor Ferreira da Silva was actually one of our most prominent chemistry specialists.
Okay.
He was actually able to highlight the work that was being carried out in Portugal by himself and his team internationally. And he started off by engaging in training activities, so in the scope of education, first within the context of the Polytechnic Academy here in Porto, and then afterwards in the context of the University of Porto once it was established. So he was the director of the Municipal Laboratory of Porto, and the interesting thing is that chronologically it overlaps almost completely with the universe of the wine punk imaginary world. So he was in charge, he was actually invited to direct the Municipal Laboratory, Chemistry Laboratory of Porto, which specialized in identifying and preventing food fraud.
Okay.
Not only related to all sorts of foodstuffs, but also in specific to wine.
Okay.
So there's this connection, which is almost immediate. And actually there's an episode in 1919, but this was actually, well, I'm skipping phases. So I'm trying to enter the imaginary universe and I'm skipping historical facts. So he became the director of the Municipal Laboratory, but he was also professor at the Polytechnic Academy, and then afterwards University of Porto and the Faculty of Sciences in particular. So he was also in charge of coordinating the research, but mostly training and education related laboratories that were installed in the rectory building, the main building of the rectory of Porto, where our corpo of the Natural History and Science Museum of the University of Porto is located. So there was a part in this building, the most recent part, which was supposed to be a private museum of the Polytechnic Academy. And it was the original plans for this part of the building. But soon enough, there was a lot of students with a keen interest in the University of Porto, so the number of students was growing, and there was the need to enhance the space for lectures and for practical classes. So soon enough, the project of building this private museum became the project of building a laboratory which we now know as Ferreira da Silva Laboratory. So things evolved.
And a beautiful laboratory.
It's an amazing space that can allow you to dream and to imagine all sorts of alternative universes as well. But the thing is, the laboratory was firstly a chemistry laboratory as well, an analytical chemistry laboratory coordinated by Ferreira da Silva, and later on, in 1922, it was named after him as an homage for the outstanding work he was carrying out, not only in Portugal, but also all over the world. But the sad thing in this story is that the municipal laboratory was only in function throughout, I don't know, around 20 years. So it opened to the public in 1884, and then it got closed in 1907, which means that in 1919, as I was saying previously, this episode that refers directly to the wine punk, or could refer directly to the wine punk universe, took place already in the laboratory of the Faculty of Sciences, which is now the Ferreira da Silva Laboratory. So this was an episode in which we supplied all countries all over the world with wine produced in Portugal. Yes. And some of this wine was exported to Brazil. And there was a complaint about the addition of salicylic acid to the wine. So changing its properties, changing its components by hand. So Ferreira da Silva was asked to intervene to assess the wine and make sure that it was not being tampered with. So this is a very famous case. He exported the whole process internationally. He produced a report, and this is being documented. So this was actually documented at the time. So part of the analysis that were carried out in that laboratory refer directly to wine, but using it not as a fuel, as you do in the wine punk universe, but as a beverage. Like
it was a rather pioneering work. That
completely. But he's actually more famous for toxicology. If you go back in
history. He gave
history.
The first steps of criminology.
And this is interesting because we are skipping timelines. The first steps in criminology and forensics here in Portugal were given by Ferreira da Silva when he was involved in a very peculiar episode, novel-like episode taking place here in the city of Porto. And this is true. It sounds imaginary, but it's actually true. It happened in Rua das Flores, which is now one of our most famous tourism streets. And it involved one of his nephews, a child. So his mother-in-law was offered during Easter time some sweets. She received them. There was no indication as to who gave her the present, but she kept the sweets. And then later on, she gave them to her grandchildren, three of them. The children got sick. She didn't know why, but because her son-in-law was actually a very famous physician here in Porto, Dr. Vicente Urbino de Freitas, she asked them to help. So he went to their home, he administered some infusions, some enemas as well, and he asked his nephew to retain the materials he was providing, and later on, eventually, it got even worse, and he ended up dying. And Vicente Urbino de Freitas, who was very, very well renowned, actually ended up being accused of his death. All evidence pointing towards his guilt was circumstantial. So what they did was call for the opinion of experts. Amongst those experts was Ferreira da Silva. So he was the person in charge of carrying out forensic analysis of the child's remains. And with a very specific and peculiar technique, he showed that the corpse actually, or the remains at least, had some residues of alkaloids. And he produced a very controversial report that ended up in, and this happened, well, Urbino de Freitas, this happened in 1893, was actually when Vicente Urbino de Freitas got trialed and convicted for the death of his nephew. And this was due to this report. It was very controversial because the defense of Dr. Urbino de Freitas actually tried to gather experts across the world to show that that Ferreira da Silva's report wasn't actually bulletproof, and that there may have been some mistakes or at least some imprecise data, allowing them to attain those results. But the fact is that Vicente Urbino de Freitas then later on went to Brazil. He lived in Brazil, but that he never forgot, and he never changed his mind in what comes to proving his innocence. So later on, he came back to Portugal and he tried to make a case.
But he was condemned, right?
He was condemned, and he was sentenced to prison, and then he. And he actually practiced in Brazil
100 years later, does Urbino de Freitas was right? Did the report?
Nobody knows. That's the thing. Nobody knows. He was actually, Urbino de Freitas, the doctor, the physician, was actually not accused, but suspected of killing someone else in his family. So this is very controversial. Some people say that at the time, using the tools at hand, Professor Ferreira da Silva couldn't actually prove that he killed his nephew. So if we based solely on the facts, scientific facts, it's as so. But we can immediately think about an alternative universe in which we know that Urbino de Freitas is an innocent man, and we imagine some sort of discussions coming about involving the other experts, the international experts that were asked to discuss the case and to prove his innocence. So this could be done, but it's not sciences as such. Not to say that science is imaginary, because it's not necessarily,
Yes,
but the thing is, it's not well-established and undeniable truth. So.
Okay. And how did the popular opinion regarding these first steps of criminology, how did they react? Because we now know what is forensics, we all know what's a DNA proof, but at the time this was new. They had never heard of it. How did they react to this new type of evidence?
I think that the public opinion was more focused on the case itself. Okay. And on the death of a child, which is always a difficult thing to handle, and on the fact that a famous doctor could have been the murderer.
And the relative of the child.
Of course. So it's a bit weird, and people couldn't understand, and it was completely all over the news. So the media, very high media coverage. But the most interesting arguments from a scientific point of view come from his peers and not public opinion, because public opinion was more focused on the event itself and not necessarily the science underlying it. Yeah.
Regarding those that oppose Ferreira da Silva opinion of the facts from the expert point of view, who are the most famous, the most defense sources?
There was some experts coming from France, I believe, and other countries. There wasn't like a specific opponent or trying to confirm that he was not correct. So it was actually a set of experts, and they argued that he couldn't know for sure, based on the components he was trying to assess, the alkaloids that he identified in the remains, that they definitely prove that he was poisoned. So the cause-effect relationship was here being questioned. Okay. So this is pretty much it. We could also imagine a world in which Ferreira da Silva comes about as an expert or as an opponent to the Northern monarchy. You could use them. You could use this. We can create an imaginary story in which we imagine that his services are asked for some reason. I don't know. I would like to believe, because his work is quite remarkable. Regardless of this case, this is very controversial, and of course you have public opinion always engaging in discussion about it, but the most, not to say relevant, but very, very impactful work that he carried out was related to training and to building a new generation of chemists. He was actually the first director of Sociedade Portuguesa de Química, of the Portuguese Chemistry Society. He was director of the Faculty of Sciences. So his work is very, very relevant. And I would say that we would like him to be someone who would help the Northern monarchy to gain its success in overcoming not only...
Could be a friend or let's say a gentleman adversary for Mechnikov.
He could, indeed. But I would like to see him
as a friend.
As a friend and as an expert being called to share his expertise in this regard. The interesting thing is that in the course of the reconstruction process of the Natural History and Science Museum, we were actually able to rebuild the Ferreira da Silva laboratory and open it to the public. So now the laboratory exists once again, and it's open in our core pole in downtown Porto, just nearby where we are now. And it's a place for imagination. And that's something that I would like to explore, the way in which museums are places of history, of course. They keep memories, they keep history that we think actually happened, because sometimes our imagination also plays some tricks on us, and we create automatically parallel universes and imaginary universes, even if we think that we are applying all laws of science.
That's when we look to an artifact, we're looking with our eyes.
Of course, it's an interpretation. Exactly. And we try to disconnect it from the contents. We try to interpret it within its context, but things may not be exactly as we think they are. And I also believe that museums, and especially museums in the 21st century, they are not only places of history, but places of stories, of narratives, of imagination, of curiosity. So the idea is obviously to take advantage of all the heritage that we have, and this heritage can be a chemistry laboratory from the beginning of the 20th century, can be an object, it can be a specimen collected, I don't know, in the beginning of the 19th century or now, but it is also the creation process made by the visitors and those who interact with it. So all these elements come about in creating a world of imagination in a museum as well. And this is something that we actually promote. And this is something that we find is of paramount importance, actually essential when trying to build our audiences.
In fact, as far as I know, you already gave a jump from picking something that existed in a fictional world and becoming it a reality for those that come to the museum.
Yes, it's true.
Yeah,
it's true. You are talking about
certain
Sophia's
whale.
whale. Yeah,
Yeah,
this is very interesting because there's a lot of overlaps with this universe, and one of them is actually Sophia's grandfather. He was a merchant also in wine, and he built what we call Quinta do Campo Alegre, so Campo Alegre Estate, which is now the Botanical Garden of the University of Porto and the Botanical Garden of the city.
And just a small, is Sophia de Mello Breiner, I understand that we are talking.
Yeah.
Because for us, Sophia, it's all Sophia, but it was just a teaser.
Yeah. But the thing, it's one of our most famous writers and poets. So I don't know how to pronounce his name. We call it João, but he was from Danish origin, and he traveled to Porto and established in Porto, and he married Sophia's grandmother, Joana Lemon, and they bought this estate near the river so that he could take control of the ships coming by. And now we have the Botanical Garden there. And within the Botanical Garden and within the Quinta do Campo Alegre, there was this bourgeoisie palace-like house that Sophia de Mello Breiner Anderson imagined as being a palace. She calls it in her writing actually a palace of the Minotaur. But the thing is, why the whale and why the museographic metaphor and why were we able to bring we think it's an imagined tale to life. So Sophia de Mello Breiner Anderson is one of our most famous children tales writers and poets. And everyone in Portugal encounters Sophia's work as part of their mandatory education. Yeah.
And shared collective memory. Everyone has a small phrase of Sophia that loves.
And she was a lovely, and she's not controversial at all. So everyone who gets acquainted with her work actually feels moved towards her messages and the way she writes. Unfortunately, she's not translated into many languages yet. Yes. So this is something that it's very, very national driven, but she has been acknowledged as one of the most prominent or relevant writers. And she was born in the city of Porto. She lived nearby the Quinta do Campo Alegre, and she spent part of her summer vacations together with her cousin, also a writer, but an essayist, so more driven towards an adult audience, Rubenau. So he actually lived for a while in Quinta do Campo Alegre. So they lived there as children. So it's no surprise that they felt inspired to incorporate some of the elements of Quinta do Campo Alegre into their work. So if you read Sophia's tales, there's a lot of references to the plants, to the lakes, to the spaces within the botanical garden.
To the gardens.
Yeah.
Itself.
But in one particular tale, which is called Saga, and it was published in a lovely book called Stories of Land and Sea. The translation would be something like this. She tells the story of the coming to Porto of a Danish sailor, which we now know it's her great-grandfather. Yeah. And he comes to the city of Porto. We know it's the city of Porto through the many references, even though she never writes that's the city of Porto. And she says that within the city, there's this huge house. It was so big that you could ride a bicycle in each of the rooms. And all of these rooms open up to a main hall, an atrium. And this was the only place in that city where you could put together the whale skeleton that for years have been resting packed up in boxes in the basements of the Faculty of Sciences. So again, the Faculty of Sciences. So she imagined that house being so big that you could feed a whale in it. The house exists, and it is the Hall of Biodiversity now, which is inside the Botanical Garden. And the whale also exists.
And it's standing in the wall.
And the whale, it's the most lovely story. It came to shore, unfortunately already dead, in 1937. It was purchased by a merchant in animal fat. He had a big, how do you call it, a plan here in the Avenida da Boa Vista. And by that time, the director of the Natural History Museum was Professor Augusto Nobre, brother of António Nobre, another famous writer here from Porto. So you see, just a small note. So museums are also a place of confluence of areas, imagination and art, science, literature, and all these tales come about to build what we now know as a museum and what ourselves understand as being the Natural History and Science Museum. So the director of the Natural History Museum, which was part of the Faculty of Sciences, hence the reference, he mentioned that he expressed actually his interest in having access to the whale skeleton. So the merchant actually gave him the whale skeleton. And the whale skeleton in 1937 was taken to the premises of the same building where we have the Laboratório Ferreira da Silva now, the Ferreira da Silva Laboratory.
It's the rectorate.
And it's the core pole of the museum, and it was then the Natural History Museum. And it was put together there in 41. So from 37 to 41, it actually was packed in boxes. The thing is, we don't really know when Sophia saw the whale skeleton, how she heard about this story. So she could have heard something, someone could have told her about this, or if she imagined it. But what we did was actually took this story and create a narrative surrounding it, in which our whole museographic discourse and narrative for the overall project of the museum is built upon. So what we did was take the whale skeleton, have it remounted, and installed it in the Hall of Biodiversity, where Sophia's grandparents' house used to be. So what we did was take an imaginary story that we don't really know if it's imaginary or not, and then making it come to life and creating a real universe based on an alternative universe. So
Yes.
this is something
You pick up a beautiful poetic allegory.
Exactly.
And made the allegory full reality.
It's true. It's true.
And it's a delight. I myself went into the Hall of Biodiversity, and that big whale skeleton there hanging from the ceiling, it's great.
And it's lovely because the place is very, very beautiful. We also play quite a lot with aesthetics, and there's the only thing that's more beautiful than that whale skeleton in particular are whales, so live whales. Whales are also animals that pass us along a message of tranquility and of hope. So you have all of these elements, these emotional elements coming together within a single museum object. And what is also interesting, and in connection to the wine punk universe and to the relationship of Sophia's grandfather with wine, is the fact that in this great hall where the whale skeleton now swims, you have some decorative elements that refer to vineyards that we also have planted in the garden, because obviously the botanical garden is a collection, is a live collection of plants. So you have all these dots connected in a very interesting puzzle that hopefully will give us some space to build many parallel universes.
In a creative symbiosis.
But we have also other
But
incursions.
you are being modest, because you are just referencing the wine punk alternative history universe, and in fact the museum has its own universe of alternative history.
Yes, we do. And it's more botanically driven. So the curator of our herbarium, Cristiana Vieira, she was able, together with a colleague, Manuel Miranda, she and some guests, but the two of them were able to create an alternative universe based on what they call botanic or botany fictions. So what they do is to take characters that were real from the history of our museum, from the history of the city of Porto. We have names like Carolina Michaelis, we have names like Gonçalo Sampaio, who is also linked to the Botanical Garden, and many more. And she imagines letters that could have been written by them as part of their explorations and expeditions, their stays during summertime in a given environment. So she takes facts, they take facts that are real. They, at least the characters sometimes are real. Some of them, some of the letters are really, really very imaginative.
And then hear them. It's in podcast,
yes,
right?
and it's a podcast project launched by Casa Comum. So as a reply to the pandemic in 2020, we all went home, and it was necessary to stay in touch and to show that we are still here and that culture is alive and that we are still open to our public. So the museum, invited by Casa Comum, because actually Casa Comum was the entity that launched this podcast project, coordinated by Paulo Guzmão.
Yes.
Who is also a magician in what comes to special effects and sound effects. So these are very, unfortunately, some of them are only in Portuguese, but they are top quality.
Yes, they are.
And you can believe this. And some of them
Or
are
you
from,
can learn Portuguese and see.
yes, of course. And some of them are produced by the museum, and botanic or botany fictions are one of them. We have others also based on collection objects, but that don't address as directly as these ones this alternative
There's
universe.
one thing interesting, because, and I totally agree, in a 21st century museum should be places of storytelling and new narratives of imagination and memory alike, but they still are very linked as preserving the artifacts of the past.
It's true.
And when you develop alternative history universes, you can choose divergence points, interesting. Many times the interest in the small details, the small things that escape us. And sometimes all our perception of reality is based on what we believe that happened.
True.
And many times what actually happened in all his full glory, it's not carried on throughout the time. And why I'm saying this is because I know that you have found in recent times artifacts and documents regarding one famous naturalist.
Francisco Newton. You're talking about
Exactly.
Francisco Newton. Yes.
And that had been lost, and through his collection with 100 years, if I'm not mistaken, it was able
1903,
to
I believe.
found new scientific knowledge for the today.
Yeah.
So facts that were lost for 100 years
are now recovered and brought back to light. Yeah. The thing is, Francisco Newton was one very, very famous and very proficient naturalist. And he collected an animal specimen, a frog, in what is now, it's Angola, it's Kwanza, the south of Kwanza, but it's Angola, true. And it was incorporated in the museum, not the Natural History and Science Museum, but its predecessor, so the Natural History Museum. And it stayed there, identified as a given species. But now, just recently, our colleagues, it was a work coordinated by Luís Siriaco, together with a master student. So this is very, very interesting, because this shows even how museums are quite relevant today for our students. And being in a university museum, for us, this is absolutely, not only exciting, but mandatory. So they were assessing these specimens, and they noticed that the color pattern didn't match what they had in mind, because they are very knowledgeable of biodiversity in that region of the globe, and they were suspicious about this specimen in particular. So they went on studying, comparing it to other specimens, asking for collaboration from their colleagues internationally, and they ended up identifying a new species based on the species that had already been in store in the basements in our storage space. So it's true. Museum objects aren't really still and crystallized elements that tell you a single point or episode of history. They can be reinterpreted, and we have many stories like that. This is very interesting, because, as you say, for 100 years, no one could have even imagined that a new species was there.
Yes.
But we have other objects. For instance, we have some dolls, we call them Muila dolls, and this is very interesting. They are representative of a cultural, an ethnic or a cultural group, also in Angola. And researchers all over the world who study these dolls, they thought that they were, obviously all dolls, all elements are symbolic, they have a meaning, but they thought that they were more related to rituals.
Okay.
And this was discussed and this was believed from, I don't know, many years since they started collecting these elements. But from the 90s on to this day, researchers who studied these artifacts started believing that maybe this story wasn't for sure what was happening with those dolls and why they were being produced as icons. So as soon as more evidence came to light, and this happened already in the beginning of the 21st century, they, or late 20th century, they were able to understand that these dolls were not used as idols, but they were actually used as dolls. They were offered to women or girls when they enter the adolescent stage. So they may have some meaning, but currently researchers know that they are being replaced by plastic dolls as well. So you see,
Barbie power.
Yeah, something like that. But the curious thing is that you need, as Rita Gaspar, our curator, for these collections, well, puts it in a curiosity video that we produced to tell this story, and it's available also in Portuguese, but also with English subtitles. She explains that it's what we know. It's true. You need to go back and look at the objects, and these may be objects, this may be specimens, but there's not a single story. There's not a single history. There are interpretations, and as soon as you gather more evidence, everything can change.
Yes.
But this is also the beauty of science.
Moment, because
we need to keep track of time. Everything
yes,
is
we have
control.
to. And I know this is a faux pas, is being rude, but the fact is this is an instrument of work, particularly my watch.
Yeah, you're not watching your text messages, you're keeping track of time.
Exactly. And we still have time for, I would like to make a provocation. Yesterday we had in the invited lecture session, Professor Fatima Lambert, and among other interesting things, we talked about the invisibility that many names, women, but not only women, many male artists also, who were admired and esteemed in their own time, suddenly they become invisible and absent from the official storyline. And what are the causes for invisibility of these names, which change the perception we have of art, of history, of ourselves, because we are built from memories, from familiar memories, yes, but also from cultural memories. And when the memories are disturbed, or stained, or have holes in it, we also end up by inherent those holes and those deturpations. And try. This is the problem of life. We are full of special effects today.
At least some sound effects.
Yes. And we try to explore a little bit the reasons for this type of invisibility. And because usually people say, oh, it's the patriarchy, but the fact is male names also are
missing from here.
Not as many, that's a fact. But so it could be another reason also for that. And one of the things she proposed as a possibility is, in a way, knowledge is preserved by academia.
True.
Universities
to some extent.
Many extents. And we pass knowledge, and it was interesting that you mentioned that a master student helped to identify the new species.
It was her work.
Because it comes from there, the older generation, the new generation, and the building up of knowledge passing on. And that sometimes it could be easier to, instead of being hands-on on things forgotten, in depositories,
Yeah.
in museums, in collections. You will go to the books already written and build knowledge from the books instead of going to the sources. And if it is a strong possibility that if you could, I don't know, things a bit so that these types of masters and PhDs also needed at least a quarter of study going straight to the collections. What's full of dust? Like the proverbial Indiana Jones Ark of the depository, and really find out what the past has left us and what we missed from the past, and truly find out what's invisible.
But I do believe that's the power of museums, because we strive as much as we can not to have objects full of dust, but have them properly taken care of and easily and readily available to everyone. Especially, of course, to the research community, to the academic community. It's part of our mission, but also to the wider audience. And our idea is to have these through different sorts of approaches, of course, but is to have these objects available so that people can build their own stories and know for sure. This is part of the way in which you produce science. So you need to be able to replicate someone else's experiment, and you need to access the raw data. And the raw data is within museums' collection. Regardless of the interpretation that is done, you need to access the object. So when we believe, of course, museums have archives, and these are of paramount importance, because sometimes you can only make sense of how an object came to be in that specific place because of the record that someone kept along the years. So this is obviously essential, but we need to provide access to the original object. And at least in the Natural History and Science Museum, much influenced, of course, by the vision of our directors, Professor Nuno Ferran, Professora Fátima Vieira, we really need to engage, and it's something that we are committed to. We really need to engage people with various backgrounds from various fields. This means that sometimes the interpretation that is being made of a given object may not be scientific. It can be artistic, it can be imaginary. The objects are there to be reinterpreted and studied, and for us to make sense of what we are doing here. So our goal as a museum is actually to spark curiosity about life. And in order to do so, and obviously share some of the knowledge that is being built, but having people feel comfortable with doubt and with questions. So it's not to say this is written and the characters are these characters and this is how everything took place. That's just a report of something that happened and that you cannot have access to. Even if you lived it, there's other people living it with different viewpoints. So there are no safe answers, there are no real answers, there are no undeniable truth. That's what museums actually.
In a way, our present, we had this couple of years were very virtual for many of us.
Yeah.
And the virtual has come to stay. It's the new catchphrase now, the cliche. But this new frontier between the collections of museums and now the collections of museums starting to be in virtual online, yeah. It can open new possibilities for everyone to access them.
Of course. Everything, all of our, the way in which we explore technology, and the digital is obviously technology, can go both ways. So it's different if you see the object. It's different to see the whale skeleton than to read about it or to look at a wonderful picture of it. It's the same as when you visit a natural landscape, you go to the Grand Canyon, it's not the same. You cannot even take a proper picture. Now you have drones and you can get technology, but it's not the same as being there and living that and having all your senses being infused by that reality. But of course, the digital is very powerful and essential nowadays, so that people that can't at a given time frame access the real object or the original object to at least know that it exists. So I do believe that you need to find a balance. I don't see technology, of course we are very tired of being on our computers, we know that, but if we didn't have computers, we would have been isolated. completely, or even more than we are. So it's just a matter of trying to find not the silver lining, but the silver lining and the balance between all the elements that you have access to.
Point of equilibrium.
Of course, which is difficult, and it can vary. So it's not stable. It's not the same equilibrium throughout your whole life, throughout your whole work, or when addressing different topics or trying to gather information about different sources. But what we are also doing in the museum is having our collections online. So we are building our database, and we are trying to find the key to make this database not only suitable for academics, but to teachers, young children, families, So the idea is actually to be there, to be of use to everyone. That's our mission. Obviously, we are very lucky and very fortunate to have this heritage and not just be trying to invent new and interesting activities and engagement actions, but it's again trying to find the balance between preserving the objects and making them available to everyone. And some of the activities that we are trying to outline and are already outlining to engage people, some are more science driven, some are more, of course, being a university museum and being a science museum, we are committed to science, precision, and rigor. We cannot make mistakes as much as we can, because making mistakes is how we evolve and we learn. So we are knowledgeable of that, and we try to share that message. But the kind of tools that we use are not only digital, but they are also creative. So creative writing, these artistic performances and interpretations of our scientific heritage, that's something that we really, really value. And literature as well. So even though our core is science, we try to open new ways of establishing dialogue with other areas so that we can make the most of what we actually have to share.
In our first invited lecture sessions, I asked in the end to Professor Nelson and Professor Rosa, why is it when we imagine storytelling regarding alternative or fictional worlds, they usually are very pessimistic, very sad, no one is happy, there are no happy endings, everyone suffers and then dies horribly, usually. And Professor Rosa, in a very funny way, said, because it's like a scary movie, you will remember.
If it's intense, if it's.
However, we are creatures that like to laugh and like to be joyful. And museums also could have a possibility not only to scare regarding real life dangers, we should be scared about many things.
I'm so happy that you're making this comment.
But we should also be happy about many things, not always gloom. There is enough gloom for us to be really worried and fight and do many actions regarding this. But there's always a space for hope.
True.
And how can museums
I was saying that I'm really, really happy because the approach we have and the take we play on biodiversity loss and the promotion of sustainability, which is obviously a problem that we all face globally, regardless, or that we were now more focused on because of the pandemic. The thing is, we now know that we live in a global society, we are all connected, and what happens elsewhere in the world, even though we cannot daily pay attention to it, it's something that's impactful on a wider scale.
It will reach us.
It will eventually. So even if we are self-centered, we should be careful of the way in which we treat our planet and our peers all over the globe. But biodiversity loss and the loss of sustainability and the loss of not a future that we can be proud of, but an actual future. This is something very, very meaningful and very something that we should be worried about. So COP26 just happened a few weeks ago, but usually, as you were commenting, the take on this issue is always, or almost always, or many times, very negative and pessimistic. And if you present someone, if I am presented with something that's so gloom, so dark, so difficult to change, I won't feel motivated to make the change happen. So what we are doing, at least in the Natural History Museum, but this is consonant, it's in line with many other museums. We are part of, well, European networks, sharing these experiences with museums that have the same outlook on how these issues should be handled. We are quite optimistic. We are quite positive in the messages we provide. And I think this is mandatory. When you enter the Hall of Biodiversity, don't tell you how many plastic are you using, we celebrate life. We celebrate diversity, life and diversity from cultural and from biological point of view. So we show you what you have to lose if you don't cherish and if you don't enjoy, if you don't take care of this diversity of which you are part of. Because sometimes what happens at least when you go to environmental issues, is that you place yourself in an outside world. So you're like someone who's staring and living vicariously other people's experiences and witnessing what's going on. But no, you are as much part of the problem as you are of the solution. So you are part of that world. And at least in the Natural History and Science Museum of the University of Porto, you can have an example of how to address these issues from a positive point of view. We also feel that that's important. Empowering people, all sorts of people, to make or to create or at least keep a better world for everyone.
In the youth fest that happened in June, if I'm not mistaken, I remember the representative of the medical faculty of medicine. Yeah. He told a very, very interesting story, and to give a bit of background of the story he was going to tell, he said that one of the most difficult things for a doctor is to convince someone to stop smoking. Yeah. And he said, if we go through the emotions, to the appeal of hope, of motivation, we could have a 25% possibility of success. But if we go through scaring, saying you will have cancer, you will die horribly, the success rate drops. For us, that is, people are more motivated through emotion, to hope, of course, than to say you're all going to die. It's
because
awful.
There's no point. If you say someone, this is awful, you can do or you should do something, what can you do? It's difficult to quit smoking.
Yes.
And if you say, well, look at your lungs, so it's difficult to...
And it's difficult to change an entire lifestyle as well. You'll have to motivate to say, there are good stuff if I do this.
We all feel motivated about positive things, about beauty, about aesthetics, regardless of cultural diversity and the patterns. So it makes sense for us to be positive in a way that we present our messages.
Yes, it was like I once heard an episode of a student ask a teacher a decade ago, I believe, are we going to all die with this climate change? This was 10 years ago. Yeah. Said, sometimes it's not a matter of dying, it's what are you going to lose? We can build digs like in the Netherlands and prevent the rise of the seas to affect us, but we will lose beaches. Yeah. Do you want to lose that? And they said, no.
Do you want to survive or do you want to live? That's the question.
We have a beautiful, magnificent environment. We want to live without it. So it's not just a matter of we'll die or we'll live, though it can be also. But how much of good life do you want to have? And that's more motivational, that I believe more dark.
Yeah. There's room for everything, but let's keep it positive.
Yes. As I said, it's not to say that the situation is not serious. That is not by any means what I wanted to say. So we, sorry.
We are 4 minutes.
We have 5 minutes for questions. Okay, thank you. And we are not sure if we received questions yet, so we can carry on. I would like to make the last final questions. When we think, going back to the beginning, like I said, Ferreira da Silva, I found it very interesting that He gave the first steps almost simultaneously in two aspects, forensics and criminology and nutrition.
Yes,
because
food quality,
food quality
and water quality as well.
and water quality 100 years ago.
Yes.
How well was this received? Namely regarding the food quality.
No, he was very well received because he prevented a lot of problems and health-related problems. So we needed the number of citizens in the city was increasing, and we needed someone who could vouch for the quality of water sources and food supply. So it was actually, he was well received.
Now, I was asking this because, as you know, Porto also had 100 years ago other pandemics.
Yeah.
They are not new for this century. We have pandemics in a cycle. It's something we have. And in the last time, Ricardo Jorge decided to put a sanitary siege around the city because that is not also anything new. It has happened before.
True.
Anyone who knows about the Black Plague knows that
100%.
even in medieval ages, they knew that social distancing could make a difference. So no one is inventing nothing new at the moment. And the people of Porto was really angry with him, and he had to flee the city on account to save his life. And I was wondering if there was this type of episode, but apparently regarding Ferreira da Silva, people accepted easily.
I think so. At least I'm not completely aware of all the details. We would need to call Marisa Monteiro, who is the curator of scientific instruments in our museum, and she has a deep knowledge of all this history. She could tell you all sorts of details. But what I imagine is that there wasn't a crisis. You know, these were standard analyses that needed to be carried out, and they needed someone who was efficient and professional to do it. So he was in charge of this, and he had a very good reputation. So I think any trouble that may have occurred refer to commercial and enterprises, commercial agents and enterprises, and not necessarily the common citizen.
Okay.
Because his work was of great importance from a positive point of view to the common citizens.
Because in the first day of the WhatIf’21, Professor Alfredo Berens did make an interesting comment regarding Ricardo Jorge. Was the people angry because it was ignorant, or he did not communicate well the reasons for the siege? Because sometimes the problem is how you explain things. We do not live in absolutisms. We live, thankfully, in democracies where freedom and rights are and should be respected. And that implies that you have to explain things, communicate in a...
but when it comes to science, it's true, and you're completely sure. And I'm going to share something that Professor Alexandre Quintanilha mentioned this week still. But when it comes to science, people want definite answers. They want someone to say it's 100% sure. Will the vaccine work? Why doesn't it work? So when science is completely the opposite, it's just trying and testing hypotheses and trying to prove that they are wrong, and they hold until someone proves they are wrong. But communication is very important. And what we witnessed, and going back to what Professor Alexandre Quintanilha mentioned, what we witnessed during this pandemic and in the first stage of the pandemic, at least here in Portugal, you had politicians, you had physicians, you had everyone who could share their opinion in media, saying for sure, we know this has been trialed in other countries. We know that this doesn't work. We don't know how this works. So people were quite honest. You knew that the scientific community and the medical community was puzzled as much as they were. And I believe that had a positive impact in how respectful people were of their behavior towards one another. Of course, there was a lot of fear.
Numbers can lie, but numbers can also say the truth.
And-
And 85% of vaccinated person are undeniable.
Yeah.
People listen.
Yeah.
That's
So, and we actually understood that there's not enough knowledge. This is a new thing to us. Obviously, pandemics have happened in the past. They have a tendency to become increasingly frequent, at least if we don't respect ourselves and our planet. But the truth is that we don't know, and it's okay sometimes to
say that we don't know.
so that we don't know, and that we need to be careful. So communication
And that
plays an
we'll
important role
walk
here.
the path together.
Yeah.
We know so far like this,
Yeah,
and this
let's
will protect you
stay safe.
in many
Yeah.
aspects, and the rest
Yeah,
we'll find
yeah.
out later.
So this is a
And,
nice example of what
yes.
you were actually, the message you're trying to
I
convey.
Well, I think our time is up, right? We have. And well, I will make the concluding remarks. It was really a pleasure to have you here and to hear more about the museum and all these interesting projects that you have been going through, even during the pandemic, and will go through in the
Yes.
future. And I hope this was the beginning and not the end. And I would like to conclude now the third invited lectures at face-to-face session of the WhatIf’21, and thank everyone that watched us. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.